I think that a lot of focus or priorities is always ebb and flow a little bit over the years. And sometimes it's driven by regulation, sometimes driven by investors. But, so far we have seen last year, from the year beginning, that it was all about supply chain security and, resilience of your supply chain. And for later on, right now, or we're talking about in terms of investors' questions, we are talking about that retention, employee retention, recruitment, and the other elements is energy security. So there are quite a lot of topics that is always been changing. It depends on the circumstances at the time. But I have to say that, if you step back a little bit and look at it from a broader, kind of wider angle, is that regulations is one thing that is been driving business focus, I have to say. Right now there are quite a lot of discussions about decarbonization and also related to the energy security piece. But it has become a main topic. But more and more that there are social elements is coming through as well. Discussions about employee welfare, employee recruitment, retention. So those are the topics that are always changing. But regulations is the driving force behind it. I think it depends on the geographical locations of your investors. I think different group of investors. So, U.S. investors will be very different to what they're looking at or focusing on. Would be very different to the Asian investors, for example. And also depends on the companies as well. If you are talking about oil and gas company, the focus would be on decarbonization. Whereas if you are working in a consumer services industries, then the focus will be employees. So I think it really depends on quite a lot of factors. So there's no single one. For us, it's always been decarbonization, and given that we are manufacturing or industrial business, so I think that's how I see it is. But in terms of longer trends, I have seen that the investor focus has been changing from previously as governance matters, particularly in the UK, Europe, and governance right now is kind of changing into environmental, social, so that there's kind of a gradual transitioning. I'm not saying that governance is not important, but it's definitely laying on top. There are more discussions about social and environmental impacts. From a small and mid-cap perspective, we did the TCFD reporting framework last year, was the first year. We did report against 11 recommendations of TCFD, but we made qualitative commentaries in terms of our strategy, decarbonization strategy. But this year we are going to do a bit more in-depth quantitative commentaries on our strategy. Now, when I was going through the whole exercise, a little bit more in depth in terms of scenario analysis, and the main issue I do see it is that we are. Businesses do planning. It's normally planned according to 3 to 5 years, a very short term, and sometimes even 1 year. You never know what's going to happen the next year, and business strategy change, and so TCFD is asking us to look at a much longer term, and sometimes out to 2100. this is almost impossible for business to imagine. How can you do your cash flow analysis, based on a 50 years time frame? You can't. So I think that's one way that I think quite a lot of business, certainly from our perspective, when we started it, it feels almost like, oh God, this is too hypothetical. How can we actually make it more real? And aligning the business planning and TCFD strategy, it's I would say that it's a challenge. And the second thing is in terms of trying to set up a separate strategy for TCFD is quite difficult. Because eventually what you're doing needs to be aligning with the TCFD strategy. So I would say still at the moment it's still kind of in terms of scenario quantifying that impact, and that's the most difficult piece for us. We don't report Scope 3, or we report it as selected amount of or elements of Scope 3. We are planning to report our Scope 3 emissions. So we're already reporting Scope 1 and 2 over the years. Is been well established, but Scope 3 is still definitely one of the areas that we are still working on. We do tell investors say that we're working on it to make sure that give them a timeline in terms of when we're expecting that the Scope 3 emissions inventories will be available. And certainly because we are going to announce our net zero strategy and plan shortly this week, and so in effect we set out our timeline in terms of Scope 3 reporting, but also the expected plan for the Scope 3. We wanted to be aligned with the SBTi with our Scope 3 reduction plan as well. So I think investors looking at it, and they understand that the challenges that business having to quantify the Scope 3, because it is a difficult element. But we, given the works that we are doing right now, we pretty much understand or know roughly what are the categories of Scope 3 emissions are most important to us. Basically set out a rough plan already to try to address those. So yes, I mean, investors understand that what our challenges. I don't have three, but I think one that I have in my mind is in effect how to navigate all these incoming regulations. There are many of them. So we talked about it earlier at the panel session. Is that you have TCFD in the UK, and then you have the taxonomies that is coming through in Europe, and well, actually the UK taxonomies is about to come as well. The UK government just announced that company needs to publish their transition plan, and so that there are so many regulations, and of course the ISSB and work with IFRS to set out the sustainability standards, and that is about to come. So I think the final consultation is already out. So there's so many regulations incoming. How do we make sure as IRO to get our head around and actually communicate it clearly internally as well as externally, how important it is to get the internal buy-in, but also externally set out your strategy for all these regulations, and that's would be the biggest challenge for IRO, I believe, within at least within the next 2 to 3 years.